So I'm going to talk to you for a few minutes about passion. From being here today, it's very clear to me that we're quite a passionate bunch. We're passionate about dancers and dancing, and we're passionate about dance psychology. So it only seems fitting that we spend a bit of time thinking about what passion actually is. So I'm going to introduce the passion model. I'm going to talk about how passion relates to performance. I'm going to zoom in a little bit on obsessive passion in dance. We'll consider how passion plays a role in participation in dance, and then we'll finish with thinking about how we can actually promote a healthy type of passion for dance. So passion is a word that we use all the time in dance and in the performing arts, quite rightly so, and there's certainly plenty of anecdotal evidence that indicates that we need to be passionate about what we do in order to succeed. So Darcy Bussell herself once said, "No one can go into dance and not want it really badly." But what do we really mean by passion? How can we define it? Can we measure it? And why does it matter? In this talk, I'm going to introduce the dualistic model of passion and talk about how it relates to things like commitment, well-being, and injury. So the dualistic model of passion was developed by Robert Vallerand and his colleagues over in Canada, and it states that we are passionate about an activity when we like it, when we value it highly, and when we spend a lot of time and effort on it. This activity then becomes internalised into our identity, so it becomes part of who we are. So I am a dancer rather than simply somebody who takes dance classes. But the way in which this activity becomes internalised into our identity can be in a more controlled way or in a more autonomous way. And when it's more autonomous, this gives rise to what's known as harmonious passion. And harmonious passion is characterised by a flexible engagement in the activity. Where we love the activity, we can engage in it of our own volition, but if things do seem to start to go wrong, we can withdraw from it without any real negative consequences. On the other hand, the activity might become internalised into our identity in a more controlled way, and this gives rise to what's known as obsessive passion. And this type of passion is characterised by a rigid persistence in the activity, where we feel an urge or a need to engage in the activity, often because we associate or attach certain contingencies to it, like our self-esteem or feelings of social acceptance. Now, there's been a lot of research using this model in a whole variety of different domains, and generally speaking, these two types of passion do have quite divergent effects in terms of well-being. So, for example, this more harmonious type of passion has been associated with factors like flow, which is where we sort of lose ourselves in what we're doing, with more positive affect, more vitality, greater well-being, and greater self-esteem. And this more obsessive type of passion has been generally associated with more negative outcomes, so things like guilt. So often we engage in our passionate activity when we should be doing something else. It's also been associated with rumination, so when we're not able to engage in our favourite activity, we spend a lot of time thinking about it and wishing that we were doing it. Not surprisingly, this often gives rise to conflict with other life areas, but also it has been associated with other factors like anxiety, like burnout, and engagement in what's termed risky behaviours. An example of this being, in the original tests of this model, the researchers looked at cyclists in Canada. And in the winter months in Canada, it gets very cold, and the cycle paths become very icy and very treacherous. And what the researchers found was that when the cyclists were more obsessively passionate about cycling, they carried on cycling even in the face of this kind of danger and risk, whereas those who were more harmoniously passionate about cycling were able to stop for that brief period of time. Now, it's important to note at this point that we're not either harmoniously or obsessively passionate about something. We do tend to have levels of both, but even moderate levels of obsessive passion have been associated with these sorts of negative outcomes. So it's quite clear in terms of well-being which kind of passion we'd prefer to promote among dancers, but what sort of relationships does passion have with performance? Researchers have looked at passion in relation to what's termed deliberate practice. So as we just heard, the often cited 10,000 hour rule, where we have to engage in a specific type of practice, structured activity where we're trying to work on specific skills. The researchers also looked at the kinds of goals that people adopt and whether that related to their performance. And these studies were conducted with musicians, with athletes, and with students of drama and psychology. And interestingly, both of the types of passion were associated with improved performance, but this kind of relationship happened in quite different ways. So first of all, harmonious passion. This was associated with the adoption of what were termed mastery goals. So these are self-reference kind of goals, which essentially means that I want to do better than I did yesterday. So it's about being in competition with myself and trying to improve on my own personal goals and skills. This was then shown to predict the amount of deliberate practice that people engaged in, which resulted in improved performance and also was a sort of nice side effect in greater well-being. A very similar kind of pathway was shown with obsessive passion as well. So when people were very obsessively passionate about their activity, they tended to adopt these mastery type goals, which predicted the amount of deliberate practice they engaged in, which did improve performance, but it didn't, interestingly, have an impact on their well-being. But going over to the dark side, there was another outcome associated with obsessive passion. And this research showed that people who were very obsessively passionate also adopted what are called performance goals. So this is where learning is other reference. So I want to do better than everybody else. So I'm in competition with others around me. I want to demonstrate superior performance. This type of goal also predicted deliberate practice, but performance actually decreased. And so the researchers said, well, actually, when people are very obsessively passionate about an activity, it seems that they try to succeed by any means, even if those means aren't particularly successful. And there's very recent research which indicates that high levels of obsessive passion are associated with a fear of failure. So perhaps when people are very obsessive about an activity, they're driven by this fear of failure and they try to succeed, they try to achieve by any means possible, whether or not these are adaptive or maladaptive. And I just want to take a moment to zoom in on obsessive passion and look specifically at the research that's been conducted in dance. First of all, one of the first studies that related passion to dance was looking at injury. And the researchers found that among student dancers, those high in obsessive passion tended to report a greater number of chronic injuries. Now, what they also found was that these dancers tended not to seek treatment. If they did seek treatment, they didn't always follow the advice that they were given, and that they were very unwilling to stop dancing. Now, the idea with this is that when we have high levels of obsessive passion, that activity takes up a dominant place in our identities. So when we think back to our pie of life, when we looked at that large amount of the pie that was given over to dance activity, that's a really nice visual way of representing this finding. And it seems to be the case that when we are quite obsessively passionate about something and it does form a large part of our identity, it's very difficult to stop. And as we heard earlier, if we withdraw ourselves from that activity, who are we anymore without dance? When the researchers looked at the dancers who were more harmoniously passionate about dance, they didn't see this relationship with injury. And in fact, those dancers were much more likely to seek treatment if they did get injured, and they were more likely to stop dancing, probably because they were able to form their identity from lots of different sources, so that dance wasn't the sole part of who they were. We also found in recent research with professional dancers that obsessive passion was related to perfectionism. And we heard a lot about perfectionism this morning, particularly thinking about characteristics like a need for approval, ruminating and concerns over mistakes, and perceived pressure from significant others. This was also associated with disordered eating attitudes. Now, interestingly, there's a lot of research in other domains that's related perfectionism to disordered eating attitudes, and in particular self-evaluative perfectionism, which is the type of perfectionism that we heard about this morning. It seems to be the case that when we add obsessive passion into the mix, it adds another dimension to that relationship. So perhaps when we are obsessively passionate about something, it takes up a large part of our identity, and we take on the values of that activity to a large extent. So in this example, it might be those kind of aesthetic preferences or ideals that we perceive within dance. And we may try and achieve those ideals by any means possible, whether or not they are healthy or unhealthy, and unfortunately in this example, by adopting disordered eating characteristics. So in terms of well-being, the evidence does seem to suggest that we want to promote harmonious rather than obsessive passion. But one question that does remain is, in order to succeed in dance, do we need to be obsessive? Do we need to have that level of obsessive passion in order to endure the hardships and difficulties that are associated with dance training and a career in dance? There's plenty of suggestions that we need passion in order to be motivated, in order to succeed, but is a flexible or rigid type of engagement in the activity associated with adherence? Until very recently, we didn't know. So we wanted to have a look at this question. And in order to do that, we worked with talented young dancers who were engaged in high-level training. And we administered passion measures to them, so they filled in a questionnaire. And then we had another look back 12 months later to see who was still in training and who had dropped out. And we compared these dancers in terms of their passion. The first finding was that there was no real difference between the adhering dancers and those who later dropped out in terms of being passionate, so meeting those passion criteria in terms of liking dance, valuing it highly, and spending a lot of time doing it. Now, that might not be hugely surprising because you could argue that those criteria are actually quite easy to meet. But the real difference came when we looked at the harmonious passion scores, and we found that adhering students reported statistically greater harmonious passion than those who later dropped out. And even further to that, we found that harmonious passion actually statistically predicted the likelihood of adhering to training or committing to training. So the more harmoniously passionate that student dancers were about dance, the more likely they were to stick at their training. What was really interesting and I think quite encouraging about this research was that obsessive passion didn't seem to play a role at all. So when we looked back at the statistics, we didn't find any significant relationships between obsessive passion and adherence or dropout. So at least among student dancers who are engaged in high-level training, it doesn't seem to be the case that they need to be obsessive in order to stick at what they're doing, which I think is really encouraging. So, all of the evidence seems to suggest that we need to be more harmoniously than obsessively passionate about dance. So how can we do that? One study of musicians compared beginners with experts in terms of the meeting the passion criteria, so again, liking the activity, valuing it highly, and spending a lot of time on it. And they found that 36% of beginner musicians met those criteria, while 100% of experts did. Now, they didn't know exactly how or why that was the case because it was a cross-sectional study, so they suggested either if you lack passion for an activity, you probably drop out along the way, or passion develops over time. And it's probably the case that it's a combination of the two. I'm not going to try and suggest that we can make people be passionate about dance, however much we might want to do that. What we might be able to have an influence over is the extent to which they are harmoniously or obsessively passionate about dance. And autonomy support is a word that we've already heard quite a lot today, and perhaps it's going to be one of the kind of take-home messages from this whole event, because very recent research in dance and in music is indicating that autonomy-supported behaviours from significant others, like parents, like teachers, is associated with the development of harmonious passion among young people. And in fact, it does seem to be the case that there's a pathway from autonomy-supported behaviours from significant others to the development of harmonious passion to persistence in the activity. So how can we do that? Autonomy support can be achieved in two key ways. The first one is giving choices in classes, making dancers feel like they have a voice, like they matter, like what they do and say counts. And it might be very simple things that we can do. So for example, what kind of music would you like today to accompany this phrase? Which wall of the studio do you want to be the front today? It might be incorporating some improvisation into technique exercises. So why don't you improvise the arms to a footwork phrase? So there are lots of different ways that we can incorporate choice into classes. And another key thing we can do is to explain the rationales behind exercises and tasks. So why are we doing this? What's the principle? What's the aim behind this movement or this sequence? What are we actually trying to achieve? To help students to feel that they are responsible for their own learning, and hopefully they'll start to adopt those sorts of mastery self-reference goals that we know are associated with better performance and also with better well-being. It also seems really important to encourage students to develop other interests outside of dance. I think that's quite a tricky one. As teachers, we want students to be passionate. We love passionate students. We love the students who eat, breathe and sleep dance. So how can we try and encourage these students to cultivate other interests, to cultivate other social groups outside of dance? And I think it's very difficult to try and suggest that you could easily tell the difference between somebody who's more harmoniously or more obsessively passionate about dance without administering a questionnaire, but it might just be worth asking those very eager, those very keen students about the other kinds of hobbies and activities they're engaged in and who they sort of hang out with outside of school and during school, so that we can start to get a sense of their life and whether their pie of life is indeed full or if it's mainly filled with dance activities. So to conclude, A whole range of evidence in a range of domains, including dance and other performing arts, indicates that the two types of passion can have quite divergent effects on participation, well-being and performance. And certainly harmonious passion is the one that we want to encourage and to try and facilitate. And in order to do that, we need to think about using more autonomy supported behaviours within our classes to facilitate the development of that healthier type of passion. So thank you very much, and I'm very happy to take some questions if we have time.
Roger Wallman from London. You said there was a relationship between obsessive passion and perfectionism, but can you explain to us if there is genuinely any difference between those two phrases? To me, they seem exactly the same.
Yes, thank you for that comment. I think it's very true and very relevant, and in fact certainly listening to Dr. Hall's presentation this morning and the characteristics and the definitions of perfectionism do bear real similarities to obsessive passion. And I suppose the way that we could try and distinguish between the two is that obsessive passion is first and foremost characterised by a love of that activity, whereas perfectionism wouldn't have to be necessarily. So I think that obsessive passion is driven by a love of that activity, and that then gives rise to a desire to succeed. But I think conceptually they are very similar, and I think it's worth exploring that a little bit more in future research. Yeah, thank you for that.